Well, hey, here we are talking about coaching and psychedelics. I'm Yannick. As usual, I'm here with Julia. Not as usual yet, but I'm so happy to have you here.
More often.
And today we have a very special guest, Kile Ortigo. Hello, Kyle. Welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here. Yeah, excited for our conversation.
Kyle, I'm super excited to have you here because, I'm an existential coach, so I'm very fond of the existential landscape. It's the foundation from which I, relate to clients and myself and the world. And your book, which I've got here, Beyond the Narrow Life, has the beautiful subtitle, A Guide for Psychedelic Integration and Existential Exploration. So I am very fond to talk to you. Obviously, you're not a coach, you're a therapist, but I think there's a lot of overlap between existential exploration and what coaches and what therapists do. I think it's difficult to draw the line. We'll talk about these kind of things. But that's why I wanted to invite you, explore your practice a bit. But first of all, maybe to get to know you a little. We often start with a question around, well, what if you find yourself at a dinner party and you can, it's could be different dinner parties and different kind of answers. But if somebody says, hey Kyle, what do you do? What do you usually say? Given that you would tell them that you do work around psychedelics.
Yeah, that's always a interesting question because it depends on who's asking it. I mean, that's of course a psychologist thing to say. Who's asking it, what the context is, because sometimes, like if I'm around other people that do psychedelic integration, then what I do is something completely different than that. So, like I like to have a variety of tasks and interests, and that's
I can give you a context.
Give me a context and I'll go there.
So let's say I invite you to a dinner party with 25 of my coaching colleagues. And I say, here's a, we're sitting together. These are all coaches. They're curious about psychedelics. They may or may not understand anything around psychedelics. And one of those coaches sits next to you and asks you, hey, so what do you do?
Okay. So more of a professional crowd than that gets that. Yeah. I would say first and foremost that I help people really explore consciousness, their sense of meaning, their sense of agency in life. And psychedelics sometimes are involved in that because a lot of people, and I live in San Francisco Bay Area, that's where my practice is. A lot of people are having these experiences, and it's one of my areas of expertise. But they're very powerful, and there's a full range of experiences that people can have. But it's an opportunity that often opens people's minds and eyes to just the sense of mystery in life. And there's a shadow side to that too, and a feeling of overwhelm, but life in general can be like that. So I help people in exploring what their choices, what can inform their choices and what their choices may mean for their lives, with or without their experience of psychedelics being on board. The reason why I've included psychedelics in my practice and in my training and my consultation is because it does open the door for a lot of people to ask these deeper questions about life and meaning and the self that some people typically wouldn't ask as they're just trying to survive day to day. But that would be maybe a quick version of what I'd share.
Yeah, well, questions that people usually wouldn't ask is something that very much excites me. Could you give people a bit of the story of what got you into this particular line of work?
Yeah. Well, so in any sort of Ph.D. program and in clinical psychology, you're told to specialize very early and keep on specializing and over specializing. And basically what I did at every step was to buck that trend because I didn't want to be too narrow. Which probably makes sense given the title of my book, Beyond the Narrow Life. So psychedelics came on board because the first interest was sparked because of my film studies background that I was doing outside of psychology. And that was psychedelic experiences were talked about in context of film. And these deeper theories of like Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey, Carl Jung, all this stuff I got exposed to outside of the psychology department. Then in grad school, I specialized in trauma. We know that that's one of the clinical phenomena that's being in post-traumatic stress that's being addressed with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. I was doing it with traditional psychotherapy and personality research, attachment theory, as well as later specializing in substance use and addiction. So I was doing all this professional stuff that had nothing to do with psychedelics. Psychedelics were not spoken about except maybe once in all of my mainstream psychology coursework. And that was in undergrad, and I was told that LSD damaged genes, that old party line. So it wasn't until after my postdoc that I had a good friend who was also studying attachment theory and trauma and addiction work. And his name's Dr. Christopher at UCSF. And he became a MAPS co-investigator and therapist for the MDMA trials, and also did a group study on psilocybin for long-term AIDS survivors. So that's when I started, because of his work, I started getting exposed again, this time in the more of the research world and the mainstream psychology world, the potential of psychedelic experiences and kind of opening people's minds, and as part of the healing process. So one of the things, that we already alluded to is like coaching versus therapists. And with an existential model, there's a very fine line with that distinction, because ultimately we're all humans confronting similar things. Mm-hmm. So this is one of those potentials, I think, in the psychedelic world, and professionally speaking, is how it can integrate these disparate interests, interdisciplinary, that I already mentioned, and like everyday humans and people who have a diagnosis, and what that line is, and to play with that, and to see how we all struggle with some similar questions if we sit and think and are open to it. Yeah. A lot Julia, of people think of oh, go ahead.
Julia, let me get one more in, because I think, given that you just mentioned coaching and therapy, I think that might be a really important kind of distinction to draw out at this point before we get into things. Or, is there a line? There's a big gray area. Are you even familiar with coaching much? Could you speak a little bit about where you see that, especially in the context of what you just described? Existential exploration is really difficult to draw the line, in my experience, at least.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate your book too. So I was able to look into it, and you talk about this distinction. And I think one of the things that we learn as a psychologist and going through all the licensing process is really being mindful about our scope of practice and our areas of competency. And, I'll use an example in my practice. And I see a variety of people. A lot of people come with me with clinical depression or anxiety, addiction issues. And I have to rely on my training of how to help intervene and support people in that healing journey. At the same time, as I think, to kind of balance or flesh out that, have a deeper understanding of how these are still human beings in front of me. They don't follow some cookie cutter model of like how you should intervene for XYZ disorder. So I think when you really kind of look at the people that you're working with, there are certain conditions and symptoms that reach a level of clinical significance that do require a higher level of care, maybe a bit more direction. But saying all this too, I know there are different models of coaching. There are different ways you can approach coaching and being more active, more reflective. So I think really the guiding star is, what are you trained in? What do you have formal training in terms of populations and conditions? Can you partner with other practitioners? Like for me, I don't prescribe medication, so I partner with psychiatrists all the time when that's appropriate. And even spiritual providers, right? I had great experience partnering with chaplains. And that's the same with coaching. Coaching sometimes can be a bit more focused, like career coaching, which sometimes I can integrate into my practice, but sometimes it's helpful to focus in the therapy side on what the therapeutic goals are. and to have adjunctive work in these other domains. But
how often does it happen that maybe people come to you that before taking psychedelics didn't think they need therapy, and then they come and need therapy? Because I think one thing that you said earlier, like there are sometimes answers to questions that haven't been answered. So people dive deeper into holes they weren't aware of. And that's also something that I sometimes see, like people who don't think that they need therapy, but they go somewhere and maybe in the wrong setting, take psychedelics, and then they become more as a client than, or more as a patient than as a client. So do you have experience with that?
yes, I think even with these very positive, in the moment, positive, powerful, mystical like experiences that people have that we know in the therapeutic context are associated with positive outcomes, that those can be hard to integrate, and they can really kind of shake up the mind and one's worldview in ways that can feel a little destabilizing after. So sometimes that is the case. People, the pathways to me and the ways that they've incorporated psychedelics in their life is really broad. Some, it's just something they do usually at lower dose, maybe at a festival or outdoors, and they're having some experiences. We'll talk about it, but it's relatively straightforward. There's not a big shakeup in their sense of self, sense of the world. Other people have been trying to use them for healing explicitly, but feel like there's been a block. They have these experiences. I'll give one example. A client told me about a 5-MeO experience that they had before they started working with me. And they had this beautifully eloquent way of describing how they got in touch with a sense of universal love. And that's the connecting force of everything, and a deep sense of interconnectedness. But they were emotionally distant from it completely. And they didn't know how to feel that or to integrate that idea that they experience deeply in their journey and their everyday life, and what the implications of that. So that's where the work is, right? For someone like that.
Yeah, you have experienced something. Now you're trying to find your way back to that, but without the substance.
And I like thinking about the implications. Like, what are the implications of that idea of interconnectedness, of universal love? How do you, this is the problem of evil. How do you reconcile that, if that's true or experienced to be true, and the incidences of violence, right, that are just part of nature too? So these, for me, like, this is really interesting, engaging work. It's not that I provide answers to clients, right? That's part of the existential perspective. I share myself authentically with them as they explore. But I think there are a couple instances I know where people have very scary, destabilizing experiences. And sometimes, so the people I work with have used a variety of substances before they've met me. Sometimes I work in the context of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And the range of experiences, even with ketamine as an example, which I think is less common in Europe or is viewed as a hard drug. Some of my European colleagues have told me that's more common out here in America. It's not Schedule 1, so there are a lot more options. But there are people I know that have had some depersonalization, some dissociative experiences after the ketamine has worn off. So that can be part of the work, is finding ways to be grounded again, like in our consensus reality, being able to pay the bills, have relationships, engage with people, do these basic things. So it's not a panacea, and there are many different pathways. And I think you meet people where they're at and see where they need to go and help them explore that.
Yeah, and I think this is where one of the important distinctions, at least in my opinion, in coaching is, it's not necessarily that coaching doesn't have a place in healing. You can help a person heal something, but I think it's that that destabilization that you mentioned, that if somebody has an experience that really pulls the rug under their feet, where they're just free falling and they can't cope, or they're struggling to pay the bills and relate, or they're just emotional wrecks after an experience, and they need to build themselves back together, not from a place of I'm generally okay, I'm generally pretty resourceful, and I can, move forward. I can think about stuff that might be really painful from my past, but I think about it from a position of strength. I think you can coach that. But if the person is in a spot where they're really not doing well at all, I think that's where I'll draw the line to therapy, clearly.
Surely, I'm curious what your perspective is on this.
I'm really thinking about it, because yes, for me on paper, yes. And still I see a lot of people where we then in that moment need to offer help. And oftentimes it is that much stabilizing again, that they can go on and then just go into coaching sessions afterwards for integration. So it doesn't necessarily mean they need therapy after that, but some should go for therapy. So that's where we also then, with whomever I work together, then just say like, listen, this is just our boundary. I can't do what you need at the moment. So it is better to reach out to somebody else. Like oftentimes it's like that I advise like somatic therapists or something like that who work with them, because we also had it like the people then in this state of unstableness and deassociation with the body go to go to the clinic or go to a psychologist. And then that makes it worse, because they only say like, this was wrong, what you did, so now we need to fix you. So that oftentimes doesn't help at all. So it is really, I think it's very individually. And sometimes, of course, you do the wrong thing, and oftentimes you do the right thing. But it is very blurry, these lines, for me as well.
It's really nice when you have colleagues from other disciplines that you trust, and they know your work and you know theirs, right? And then you can work together on this.
For sure.
I think, certainly not just in the area of psychedelic integration or experiences, but in others, there are providers out there that have no idea what this is, and they pathologize all of these experiences. So, that's not going to be helpful for someone. Right. And it's not going to be helpful for us as providers trying to care for our clients in the best way that we can, in a 360 way.
And I think it brings up the importance of choosing the right clients for what we have to offer. And there's always a question from coaches around screening, in terms of, well, somebody comes to a coach and says, I want to do some psychedelic work. I know there's some screening protocols for the research where people get screened for, well, is a psychedelic experience going to be a risk for you or not? But there's also the screening in terms of, are you a good fit for the kind of work that I have to offer? And this goes, therapy to coaching. So I'd love to ask you that question, if it is a question. I'd love to speak to you a little bit about, how do you choose who to work with? And maybe go a little bit into, well, do you help people prepare? Do you mostly, I think you work in integration. Just love to learn a little bit more how you make those kind of choices, and the approach you take.
Well, at this stage in my career, I've kind of had this experience of, if you build it, they will come, where in my private practice, like, people reach out to me a lot of times, like family members are finding me, and then they reach out, or the clients, prospective clients reach out, and they already know a little bit about my work. So that makes screening easier, because people screen themselves.
Pre-screen, yeah.
There's that issue of my own and our individual points of competency, but also the setting that we work in. So I work in outpatient now, in individual therapy primarily. And I used to do a lot of residential, inpatient hospice work, addiction, like all this other stuff, high acuity, high suicidality rates. And I'm competent to do that, but I'm not in a setting where I can best support someone that comes in with those challenges, all of those challenges, at least to a high degree. So it's, sometimes that question is part of my screening, like what acuity level is there? What level of care might be most helpful for someone?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, quickly, when you say acuity, for people who are not familiar with the term, what do you mean?
Yeah, so level and severity of symptoms is what I'd say, like in a short-term sense, like someone's in a real crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a quick version of that. I think that's on my mind. People come to me oftentimes describing symptoms of depression, anxiety. There's a frequent history of trauma. That trauma experience may not be related directly to their presenting problems, but that's part of the assessment and kind of screening. High substance use, and usually the problematic substance use is alcohol, in my experience, sometimes marijuana. When people are coming to me for psychedelic psychotherapy, I have the party line that I have to, as every licensed provider here in California and most of the United States, we have to say we can't provide that because it's illegal. And even if it was legalized, we wouldn't be able to provide it because our licensing boards have a higher standard for evidence-based practice. And there's lots of promise, but that sometimes is the screening. Like if you're looking to do psychedelic psychotherapy, I can't do that outside of a legal research context.
Right. So if somebody would say, I've made the decision to do that, I'm going to go to the Netherlands or to somewhere where it's legal, and then I want to come back to you and do integration, or I want to have some conversations to prepare for that legal experience. Is that still not something you would be able to take on?
Yeah, this is where we get even more into the gray area, because we can't come off that we're actually encouraging the use of psychedelics. So preparation work is usually one of those lines that we try to say we don't offer preparation work. What we can do when we're already working with someone, which is usually the case, like people come in with those other issues, relationship challenges, things, looking at different career options, things like that. And then as I'm working with them, they're saying they're going to go off to retreat. In that context, I can provide psychoeducation and help with the harm and risk reduction side of things. So that is, ethically something that you should do, right? I shouldn't pretend I don't have information. I do, in the support of their overall well-being and safety. So that's something. But if someone's coming in like I want preparation support, that's usually a no, unfortunately. Like, I mean, a part of my work in the National Center for PTSD, I worked there for 5 years, was a public education, public health model. And so the resources out there, information out there that's good, vetted, is really important for people. So you can, and I have like pointed people in the right direction of some above ground resources so that they can do their research, even if I'm not able to work with them directly. So places like psychedelic.support, Arrowhead has been around for a while. Like a lot of these, Arrowhead has like a lot of scientific data that they point to and citations. So there's good information out there. But it's hard to access. If you don't know, you don't know. So some of this is really pointing people to those resources. Yeah, so I'll stop there. It's probably more I could say.
And like looking into research, because there is a lot of research now going on, where do you personally feel that for the future psychotherapy and psychedelics could be a good match?
Well, the areas that have already been studied that have been continuing to show promise, end of life anxiety, cancer related anxiety for psilocybin. My colleagues and my mentor Bill Richards, that was his work, and so that's why I was really drawn to him too, because that's, deeply existential, right? Confronting in a very acute way our mortality or the possibility of mortality. So that I think will continue to be a really important possible indicator. There's this idea that I think is also one that shows promise, but will probably not be researched in any sort of RCT systematic way, of the use of non-ordinary states of consciousness as part of an initiation ritual, initiation from adolescence to adulthood or different stages of life. Mm-hmm. And I think that has a lot of weight behind it, from a mythic historical lens too, that I think shows potential promise. I don't know if we'll ever get anything like that besides like people's use of this kind of anecdotally or based on, selection bias of people who are doing this type of work anyway.
And maybe just to jump in there, I mean, death is it's an ending, right? Existentially, we're talking about endings and temporality. And when we talk about transitions, there's an ending and a new beginning, a significant shift. So in coaching, I see that all the time, a significant ending. It might not be death and bereavement as more traditionally placed in therapy, but like something has stopped. And now I have to make sense of who I am now and how I'm moving forward with this. How am I navigating that transition? I mean, tons of coaches work with that every single day. It's just, as you say, acuity is a lot lower, because people are generally quite able to function. They just would benefit immensely from talking to a coach. And it doesn't have to involve psychedelics. It's just more and more people choose to mark this kind of occasion as a rite of passage, with something that where they can really make sense of this and open their mind in a different way. And I see more and more people choosing to do that. But, that's not therapy because, they don't necessarily have a problem, and unfortunately, most people still seek therapy because they feel they have a problem that they can't cope with, instead of just a deep exploration of self and navigating something that is deeply meaningful to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in our system in the States, I'm sure that it's similar in Europe, is based on sickness, disease, then treatment, not prevention. So, working with people as they're starting to experience the stress of these major transitions in life is probably helpful in the long run too, in prevention of something really getting out of whack in terms of their system, their relationships, this stuff happens over time, the problems, and then they can amplify.
How many people do you have coming to see you? I know we can pick up the question around what is it good for, but how many people, I don't know, percentage wise, if you can put a number on it, come to you to explore, and that generally, they just want to use therapy as a deep exploration of self or existential exploration, but not necessarily struggling with something or not being able to cope, if at all you have those people coming through your door?
Usually they do come together one way or another, but that's probably, again, because of who I am, the way I work with people, and where I work in Silicon Valley. A pretty large proportion from the early days of my practice, about a third, have been people who are exploring their gender identity and expression, and usually in the early stages of that. And so that's deeply existential work, and so that's a big part of what I've been able to do in my practice. And there are ways, and it's complicated and somewhat controversial too, but there are ways that the medical and psychotherapeutic side of that are integrated in that journey of gender identity, and then the interventions for that. Like I have to write letters, which is more based on an informed consent model for people to undergo medical transitions of various kinds. But it's deeply existential work, right? And there's also anxiety, understandable anxiety about some of that, and the reactions from other people, communication challenges, and how to advocate for oneself without, dipping too much on the passiveness or the aggressiveness. It's a lot, and a lot of stress. Positive change is stressful, right? That's something that we often forget. It is still change, and helping people manage like all the various big ideas that they have, big plans they have for the life, and making these positive changes in career, Gender identity is one subset. Relationships, going back to school, all this. I find a lot of times some of my clients, they're go-getters. They want to do it all at once. And so a lot of it is about pacing. It's all about pacing.
Slow down.
Yes. We'll do it and we'll get there, but we need to make sure that you have enough internal resources to make it through each stage.
Especially in integration sessions, like when people are new to psychedelics and they maybe did it for the first time or the second time, and then they want to leave the job, the partner, and want to move to another country. So, and then next week. So,
and become a psychedelic therapist immediately too.
Yeah. How can I become a shaman? Yeah, that's oftentimes a question.
Yeah,
I think it's a really important function of coaches, particularly, but anybody who's being approached to work post-experience. Part of that is just to slow down and perhaps not jump into massive action, which can be counterintuitive to coaches, because coaches love it when clients jump into massive action and make all the changes as fast as possible. And I really encourage coaches who are listening to this, who are doing this kind of work, considering this kind of work, that can really backfire.
Mm-hmm. It's nice. And I say that really from an empathic place too, because I know that excitement, when you're making a big change in life. But I know from experience, you got to slow down, you got to pace yourself. And so it's important and helpful, I think, again, in this human to human relationship to be able to recognize, this is challenging for all of us. And you may be having a vision for some positive, helpful changes in your life long run that will increase your sense of personal meaning, your engagement in relationships, and your sense of agency. Like all of that stuff is what I support. And there are mindful ways of going about it. So it's like being that voice of caution at times, but you're kind of helping shepherd these changes in, because you don't want to thwart them completely, because maybe changing careers is what they really need to do. Maybe this relationship is a very unhealthy one, but it's rarely a thing that works out when you're super impulsive in making that decision, that change, right?
And I know you are not working with groups at the moment, but I would be very interested about your thoughts about group sessions regarding one-on-one sessions, especially in the integration space. So what your thoughts are on that? Because I feel like sometimes this one is more important and sometimes the other one already helps enough, so that one-on-one maybe for the moment is not the right choice. So what's your experience, if you have, and what do you think about it?
Really, really important question. And I'm actually about to give a presentation on group dynamics, because they're always important and active, not just in therapy groups, not just in psychedelic ceremony groups. Like we're all embedded in communities and smaller to larger groups. And so those dynamics are always at play. The way I describe groups is they're amplifiers in good and bad ways. So, they can really accelerate one's sense of connection and healing and integration journey. And they can go off the rails depending on how storming phase the ruptures are managed. There's this idea in the CIS program, the California Institute of Integral Studies, that I'm helping out with their psychedelic training program more regularly now. There's this idea of beloved community that they've integrated more and more each cohort year into the experience. These cohorts are 100 to 300 total, so they're large. How do we kind of set up expectations of how to engage with one another? Positive engagement with one another is not necessarily modeled in our world today. So, to put it lightly.
Yeah.
Beautifully said.
So I think it takes explicit kind of conversation about this. How do we come up and cope with and become aware of, and then mitigate some of our intense feelings without denying them in a group process and context? How do we, talk about things that are more vulnerable and respond to other people who are being vulnerable in a supportive and healing way? How are we present with that? Just bearing witness. Like all these things are, easier said than done, given like the constant stressors in life. And when we're able to do that, that can really amplify the healing potential of therapy, the healing potential of these training programs and psychedelic experiences for sure. It can help in the integration process. I'll tell you some challenges I've seen, and maybe you two have as well. I've had people come to me after their first psychedelic experience, and they try to do some integration groups, and those integration groups laughed at them about how excited they were about their first experience, how meaningful it was for them, and that they want to, do this more. They're really deeply curious. Like, it was really a harsh reaction. And this is from other people that are longtime users of psychedelics. But there can be this elitism that gets embedded within groups and hierarchies, right? That's kind of
still human. Human.
Exactly. It's part of our human nature. I know we try not to be essentialists in any way as existential thinkers, but there's a part of that tends to happen. So we have to be mindful and aware of that. So that's an example. I used to think that, psychedelic experiences, that experience of interconnectedness, these mystical like experiences could be really what heals the world. If everyone just had a psychedelic experience, this is one of those early thoughts, right? If everyone just had a psychedelic experience, the world would be a better place. And now I laugh at myself, the naivete. But they can be part of a bigger picture about how we can do better and treat each other better, treat ourselves better, and start to heal some of these wounds. But we have to do that mindfully. So groups have great potential, but really have to go in all eyes open and how to make it the best experience possible.
It sometimes seems to me that people would be doing really well if they had some integration work on their experience in a group. Because groups are amplifiers. Totally agree. Psychedelics are amplifiers. There's a lot of work, a lot of stuff that comes up, and I'd say, well, just having a psychedelic experience is not going to make you a better human being. But, paired with some integration work, you probably have a pretty good chance of becoming a better human being, whatever that means. But perhaps be a bit more aware that you're currently laughing at this person who's very excited, and that's really not necessary, or, however you make sense of that.
The group thing, if you don't mind talking about it a little bit more, because I do think about this a lot. I have a lot of experiences in groups in hospital settings, in the VA, and I've seen some really wonderful things come out of groups. And like the challenges of groups are the future. They're the present as well in psychedelic experiences. It's not what's being studied primarily in psychedelic psychotherapy RCTs. Partly because of the complexity, cost. There's a lot of practical issues there, because that would need to be a closed group. You have all the members lined up, and they all kind of go through a course together. What happens because of cost and resource management is that groups just get put together. There's very little consideration about group membership, like who's going to be in a group together, who's not going to be in a group together. It's just for scheduling reasons. It's because they have some kind of surface level diagnosis that's similar. And I think that's just going to be the way it is. Like, these retreat models are like that too. Who shows up? And there's screening processes in a lot of the higher end retreats. But it's a very diverse group of people. So that can still be okay, but it's a real challenge too, because when you think about really mindfully putting together a group and facilitating a group experience and just regular old therapy, it's much harder to do than in theory, right? In practice, these groups are just kind of put together, and that's not really how things are held.
Mm. Julie, I know you run at least one group that I know of. I know you work a lot with groups, but in terms of integration work, what are your thoughts on this?
For me, it is very important. Like for me, it feels, because I thought about it in this moment. Like I'm used to work in the corporate world for many years, like running workshops there as well. And if you have only managers from one company in one room, it's the worst thing you can do actually, because they don't want to exchange anything. And it's like there are group dynamics that are hard to handle. But I feel like when people come to retreat, the different they may are, and with a lot of experience and no experience, it works nearly always quite well. I mean, yes, you feel group dynamics, and you have sometimes people leaving the room and you feel like, okay, this topic seems to be disturbing or not interesting or whatever it is. And there's always a lot of movement that you can feel. But for me, it's very positive oftentimes, because one person sharing, it's just, we always say, like when you share the shit, it smells less. And there are more people in the room who have the same topic in a way, or it is connected, or it touches their own topics as well. So there are a lot of people who, due to this sharing of other people, already get their information and get their tools they can work on. So it is always more connecting, as I feel it, than that their group dynamics are interfering or separating the people. So that's why I really love the group work. And of course, there are people who then afterwards ask for a one-on-one integration. But oftentimes I feel like the group processes already get them in the flow, and maybe they come back later for another session. So I run like official sessions where people can come from everywhere to come there online and just share. So I don't know them before. And I do on the retreats here right after the retreat, and in Holland as well, right after the retreat, in Ireland as well. So then it's just a group that is already there for a weekend. And then of course the dynamics are different in this group sharings as well.
I stayed away from groups so far within the psychedelic space. The groups I run are mostly supervision groups or training groups, but they're all full of coaches. So they're generally like with a sense of self-awareness and, basic kind of interrelational skills, not necessarily, but, maybe a somewhat higher threshold than in a general group. But what I would be concerned about when I think about opening a group and have people bring in their psychedelic experiences, that opens up a lot, maybe not for all, but for at least some in a group. If the group is large enough, there's definitely one who really probably would much better benefit from therapy. So as a coach, I would be concerned about not being able to pick that up or deal with it as it comes up. If somebody would leave the room, I would probably want to make sure they're okay. And, the kind of referral network into therapy, into other, mental health support, if that was needed. I would feel a bit uneasy in my role as a coach to open that up to a group, because the chances that we refer out are so much higher than in any, like in a work that doesn't include psychedelics. I mean, Kyle, you have the safety net of, being like you can deal with whatever is coming up because you've been trained to do so. Coaches often not, right? So that's one of the concerns I have.
Yeah. And there is scary stuff that could come up for some people. I don't know if y'all have any examples of things, but this sense of the world's not real, like that can be a part of psychedelic experiences for a lot of people, but sometimes it lingers and people really are destabilized. And so the work is kind of grounding in our consensus reality, trying to function with other people again. But that it's relatively rare from what I've seen, but it does happen. There's a clinician bias. I don't know if there are several clinician biases out there, but one of them is that we think the clients that we work with and that we see is representative of the general population, which usually makes us view these the rates of suicidality, the rates of suicide, and all this really heavy stuff is a lot higher than it is in the general population. Mm-hmm. So, if someone has a problem, I'm most likely to see it because they're seeking out a professional, right? So there's going to be a difference there. But I think it is important for us at this stage in how psychedelics and psychedelic therapy are mainstreaming in the West to be able to speak to some of the challenges in the shadow side, because we're speaking not to those people that are having positive experiences and naturally integrating in groups or by themselves, but the people that are having a harder time, that, it's not something to personalize. We're not shaming anybody, but we want to have a place to prevent that as much as possible and let people know, there is support out there and we can provide it. And there are people who are knowledgeable about some of these challenging sides of the experience.
And I think especially that is important, like being there for the people, because a lot of people just don't have anybody to talk to, and they are maybe ashamed of their experience and don't know where to go to. So it gets worse before they reach out. And I think that's why it's so important to have these, I don't know how you say it in English, low-level entry offers, where it's just easy to reach out and where you feel like you are heard and you are not crazy and people just listen to it, whatever it is that you say, and they don't laugh about you, but take you serious. And I think that is so important in this field.
Yeah, so better to have a group where there's just someone who holds space. Even if it's not a trained therapist or a coach with 10 years of experience of facilitating groups, but it's probably better to have a group to kind of open up in, but also there's risks, right? I don't know, Julia, what do you put in place so that you kind of manage that risk in the groups that you run?
I mean, on the retreats, it's that we are there. So when somebody is going out, then somebody else can follow and ask if it's fine, if it's just going to the toilet, or if there's something really wrong at the moment. In these groups where I don't know the people, it's oftentimes when I feel like somebody is sharing and it seems to be quite heavy still, that I just tell them that there is a network and to whom they can reach out if they want to, or book a private session with me, and then we can see if I'm the right person or if there's more necessary. So to make sure, but also to make this room open for these kind of sharings, because I'm more afraid of the people who don't share, who sit there in the retreat and after 3 days haven't talked in the integration. So this for me sometimes feels more like a bomb that can explode a week after than the people that share and might be uncomfortable in that situation at the moment, but they are more held and more surrounded by people who also support besides us. So than the people who don't share.
I'd love... Sorry, go ahead, Kyle. I'm going to change the topic.
We can change the topic. We could go in groups forever. It's always at the top of my mind. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'd love to bring this conversation somewhat back to your book, but like one thing that I really, really appreciated about it is how many practical exercises, activities were in there. So I know this is what coaches often are very keen on. And so I can really recommend to go to that. It's a fantastic resource with lots of stages. That's just really, really helpful. So I wonder if you could tell us about some of the ones that you most often maybe put on the table, or that people love to engage in, or that they gave you the most positive feedback on, and just so coaches get a bit of a sense what kind of things someone who's aiming at existential exploration and psychedelic integration, what they could practically do.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I'm glad that came through. Thank you for that. As a bit of a background, my first book, I co-authored, it was a treatment manual for complex trauma. And the first portion of it is a skills training for emotional awareness and regulation and communication skills and exploring relationship patterns. So that inspired me in a lot of ways. There are these opposites in the psychotherapy field that y'all are probably familiar with too, of these active interventions that have all these skills and exercises. We're not supposed to say homework, but between session exercises and practice. And then these more relational, psychodynamic, Jungian, even some existential approaches that are about the human to human relating, the process. And I've always lived in both worlds. And my excitement is about integrating opposites and finding ways to move through these opposite worlds. And so my book was an effort to do that. So I wanted to talk about these deeper questions that don't really have answers that we give people, and to help them actually actively explore, and not in a super passive way of just receiving information, reading a book. So that's why these exercises were so important to me in writing, and they were fun for me to do. And
I bet.
I think my personal favorite. There's one exercise in the book that I was actually part of the original early days of psychedelic research. I think some of the LSD research with addiction issues, alcoholism, and it's a values card sort. So it's a way of exploring our top personal values. So I created a version of that for the book. I was exposed to this through acceptance and commitment therapy, which, as an aside, is now being used in some of the psilocybin for anxiety research, I think out of NYU and Yale. So the values card sort is something I do with all of my clients always, and at different stages, but usually values and like having some sort of direction to go in life that feels this intuitive sense of purpose and meaning is important, and helping people clarify that and then work through that. So that's in my book. That's one. I think it's chapter 7.
Could I just dig into that a little bit? How does that exercise work in detail?
It's relatively simple, which most exercises I like are. But what it is, I created, and other people have a list of values, and these are like high ideals. We mentioned love as one of those, trust, engagement, agency, et cetera, et cetera. And you have them in cards, and you sift them into different piles of how important they are to you. And
how many are there?
I forget how many. I created pages worth. So
like 20, 50, 100?
50 at least in my book. My book has probably one of the longer ones because I want to be exhaustive. Because it's not about the textbook definition so much as like what this word means to you, the connotation of the word. So you go through that until you get to your top 10, top 5, and then look at what the word means to you and how you may expand living through that value as a process, not as a goal, not as a destination, in different domains of your life. And, love, since that, I don't prompt people to put love in their top 5, but it tends to actually come up very often. The missing piece for love is usually looking at the different types of love and expressions of love, and love towards self, what that means in a healthy way. And so looking at the domains of expression can be where some of the expansion of these values lie. But it's a simple exercise, and so that one's always there. You
say simple exercise. In my mind, I think about a few clients. I think about how I would respond to that. That's at least one session, no?
Oh yes, yeah. That's one session,
so it's simple, but it's not short.
It's not short. Simple in theory, right? But that's like most things in what we do. So that was one. I created some activities to break up each of the chapters, and through the different arcs. So there are 3 different arcs in my book. The first is preparation, departure in one journey, that the major theme is expansion of awareness. And then the second one is the existential trials of initiation, going through and exploring some of the fears and themes that we share and inherit just by being human, related to mortality, loss, impermanence, isolation, loneliness, interconnectedness, and meaninglessness. And then the third is integrating all those insights and kind of going off into the world, and creativity is a part of that. Mm-hmm. But for each of those arcs, I have a different exercise to break up the reading. And probably my favorite that I used was in the existential trials, were these short sentence completion tasks. So sentence completion tasks is a part of psychology assessment history. We do a lot of assessments, and it's one of my favorite. And the idea is that how people, just usually not with overthinking it, respond to sentences like "my mother is" a classic one, psychoanalytic.
Yeah.
Really gives you a lot of information about one's psychology. And so I just created a lot of my own based on these themes to help people explore what's already there and what they're feeling. So that's probably one of my favorite too, that I like to see people's responses that I work with. But yeah.
Great. Any others? Maybe something that people really liked, or that you got feedback on after the book was published?
Yeah. So in my first core chapter, it's about the cosmos, because the cosmos was never spoken about in any of my psychology training, but it's the context of everything. So I wanted to start there. And one of the exercises that I give people a choice, of course, that sense of agency is important. I give people a choice at the end of that chapter, and one of them is to go to a planetarium to see like a tour of the cosmos.
I love that
to
one
kind
too.
of really get a sense of scale of space and time. So that one stands out, and that's not coming from any other therapeutic model.
My intervention for that is listening to Brian Cox. Brian Cox is a British physicist, and just when he starts talking about the vastness of the universe, you just feel so small in such a significant way. Neil deGrasse Tyson is somebody as well. He did that show, was it on Netflix? I'm not sure where it was, but he did that show about the cosmos.
Yeah.
Was it called Cosmos? Yeah, exactly.
Called Cosmos. Mm-hmm. Carl Sagan did it originally. Yeah, and he redid it. It's really a wonderful kind of introduction. I think a lot of people think of like mainstream science as so bland and like this materialistic worldview. I definitely hear about that a lot in the psychedelic world, but it's not really that way at all when you dive deep into like the edges of our knowledge and awareness and all the mysteries that lie even within a mainstream scientific worldview, which I think is one of those kind of paradoxical things that I really like to emphasize to people. I have a lot of interest and work in psychospiritual themes, and there are multiple pathways to this sense of awe and wonder and mystery.
Yeah. I'm going to throw this one in. Recently, one was I had a conversation with Peter Hawkins, a systemic coach. He's a lot more than that, but he said he often places the client within 7 generations forth and back. He would ask, well, imagine your daughter be at her granddaughter's 5th birthday. Just to kind of zoom out significantly. I was at a conference in Iceland recently, and this guy, I forgot his name, I wish I could remember. He showed a picture. He said, well, if you talk about, it was climate change kind of a talk in a way related. He's a storyteller, great. But he said, people care about things that have an emotional connection to. So he showed a picture of his mother talking to his daughter. And daughter was, I think, 8 at the time or 10. And the grandmother, his mother, was in her 80s or 90s. So there's a connection. And he said, well, when my daughter is my mother's age, talking to her daughter and whispering her a secret, that will take us, 170 years in the future? And that's through somebody we love, who's alive now. And that really had quite an effect. And it's just that perspective change. It's not quite the cosmos, but even just a couple of generations, it has quite an effect on people. And it's something to be curious about. Coaches might ask, well, if is it my responsibility to make a client zoom out like that? And I think that's an interesting question, right? Isn't that supposed to be client led? That, they do whatever they want. If we offer those kind of exercises or homework, are we taking too much responsibility, or are we offering fantastic value? But there's a guidance, there's some direction in this, no?
Mm-hmm. But the direction, I love that activity. That's wonderful. I think it is the challenge of zooming all the way out and staying grounded, and then all the levels in between, and how to feel motivated and connected to all that expansion is important to me. I think it is our responsibility to help people actually think beyond themselves. I will say that and be clear. I think there's research that actually shows that thinking beyond ourselves increases our sense of well-being and happiness, and also can lead to altruistic pro-social behavior, which is important. It requires confronting some scary things about time and the passage of time and the trajectory we're on. And I think the part of therapy, at least, is not to instill Pollyannish or black and white thinking in an all good way either, but to help people expand their level of understanding, awareness, and ability to tolerate some distressing things in the service of being able to show up in life and show up in our relationships. So I think that type of exercise I absolutely would support. People will do with what they experience what they will. Like, there's still that sense of agency ultimately that I encourage. So it's not that I want any one person to go into a certain direction, but I think there is a real foundational importance of opening our eyes so that we can choose that direction wisely. Some of the trick is not to get overwhelmed with it. So it's that back and forth, that give and take, that pacing again that we talked about earlier. That's important there.
Yeah.
I think it's also a question from which coaching practice you come. I think these kind of questions are quite familiar for systemic coaches or therapists. So from my background, where I come from, these kind of questions are, yes, they are kind of led, but they are just opening up the cosmos of the thoughts of this client so much that they're just out of the tunnel for that moment, and they have more possibilities to think again, to find their own thoughts again and their own visions, because otherwise everything is just put down from the outside, and they have a perspective they've always had, but it's not theirs. And just breaking that up with these kind of questions, I think, can be very helpful.
Yeah, because there is that risk too from the other side of people having too much of a perspective that's about other people's needs, wants, desires, expectations, kind of the programming, where they lose sight of themselves and their own needs.
I've got a question, and feel free to say pass or yes or no, but feel free to elaborate. Do you think it's important that someone who helps people integrate psychedelic experience has had their own psychedelic experience, or had maybe a long history of psychedelic experience, understands maybe the psychopharmacology behind it, or what do you think?
I think it's an important question. I'm not going to pass on it, but thank you for that permission. That's a good skill, by the way, right? Giving people permission, even in our coaching and our psychotherapy work. I think, all things being equal, and let's say we can wave a magic wand in terms of access and legality and all that, I think it's incredibly helpful to have your own personal experience and non-ordinary states of consciousness. There are multiple pathways to that. Holotropic breath work is one that I used to think, well, how could the breath, do anything that extreme than I experienced? And it's like, okay, yeah, so the breath, we can do that. That's accessible, right? There's still some minor rule outs that you need to think about, like most things in terms of like risk with blood pressure and stuff. But there are multiple options out there for people. And I do think they're important to have some personal experience, multiple personal experiences. Because if you just have one, then you think that one is representative even for yourself, and that's not the case. And that's why I always talk about just the wide range of possible experiences that people can have in these different states of consciousness, because it's not all like this mystical sense of oneness and all positive, like what we have our measures, mystical experiences questionnaire, like we have this ideal state of a positive mystical experience. And, there's lots of gradation between that ideal state and what people can have. But I think that is important, certainly is critically important if you're going to help guide people through an experience. So like in the above ground in the States, options with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, I do think that's generally helpful to have your own experience with these medicines, so that you know the realm of possibility, but without letting your own experience bleed in and contaminate the experience of someone else, right? Yeah. So there's tricks on both sides of having experiences and not, but I do think it's something that makes the most sense for people who are wanting to really do a deep dive in facilitating or integrating these experiences for folks.
Thank you. Julia, shall we quickfire?
Yes,
I think looking at the clock. Yeah, I think so too. So we have a couple of questions that we try to ask all of our guests. So given that we have about 15 minutes, they could all have very long answers. We appreciate that. Try to make them as short as possible so we get through them all.
Sounds good. I'll try my best.
Let's see. Julia, you take the first one.
Okay, yeah. So what are books or persons, people that influenced your work or had an impact on your work?
It'll be hard to choose books, so I'll say some people. I already mentioned Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung. That was coming from my film studies work. Those are huge. I think some of the first readings from an existential lens in psychotherapy were Irvin Yalom, of course, and some of his books. And the ones he's very surprisingly open about his feelings about his patients and his countertransference and all that. And I think that was really helpful as an early therapist, learning about that. I love Bill's book, Sacred Knowledge. That one is one I recommend. I think is very helpful for folks who are interested in this work. And then I'll throw in my film studies, my mentors, their book, Projecting the Shadow, the Cyborg Myth in American Film. So just to throw in something different there.
Yeah. And maybe could you add in a film?
A specific film?
A specific film that just kind of really changed something in you?
Again, so many. I highly no.
Sorry for the question.
No. I love these questions. I love hard questions. That's part of my job. I would say undo a film and a book. The film is Arrival. I would say that movie. And the book is Dune, actually. I've been told to read Dune all my life. And I finally got around to it after I finished my book. And I was like, wow, this is really fascinating. And, the last movie was really good, but there's so much, in the book that I think people who appreciate exploring consciousness in the future and humanity and existential issues would really appreciate.
Yeah. So what's your favorite song? No, I'm kidding.
And your color.
Color is much easier to choose, I think. Somebody once interviewed me about my record collection. It's like, so what's your favorite piece of vinyl? Like, what's your favorite record? I'm like, what the hell? I could maybe bring it down to like 100. Regulation. Obviously, the therapy world is very regulated, especially in the US. Coaching is very unregulated. So I guess the question I would like to ask is, would you like to see more regulation in the coaching world? You could also take this question as the regulation you experience in the therapy world. Do you feel that's important, or do you feel that's hindering therapists entering the field or clients being able to seek help?
Yeah, these are like quick answers, right, to these very deep questions. I appreciate the challenge. What I've come to appreciate and realize as I went through training, that I had some tension with, because I'm the first one in my family to go to college. Like, class issues are really important to me, and like access to care, like all this stuff. So I was a little concerned hearing about all the talk around, this is going to sound bad, ethics, in a way that was like very hierarchical, and like you have to go through all these extra tests and all the supervision, and that doesn't always turn out the way we ideally want it to. But then over time I realized, okay, this is really critical that we talk about two parts of the ethics code. Very simple: do no harm and do good. And I think those are, like most things, simple to say, but really important and can be complicated in practice. I think there's a certain level of basic training and supervised experience that ideally would be necessary just to work with people in any sort of deep way on sensitive material. That's a lot of our jobs when we work deeply with people. And that's beyond like a medical model. Like it's tough work. So I think there's really, people are attracted to this work for a lot of different motivations too. There's more to say about that, but I think there is some utility for the public good to have some level of basic training and requirements.
Thank you. The next question is about the current or future changes. What do you see, or trends? What do you see in coaching and psychedelics, or psychotherapy and psychedelics coming up? I know we already talked a bit about it, but is there something specific regarding trends that you notice?
Well, I've just noticed in my colleagues who are not in this work, originally thinking I was kind of crazy and cutting edge. And now they're like, oh, I just saw this Netflix documentary, How to Change Your Mind. And, oh, there's this New York Times article about it. And they're like, oh, how did you know? And it's like, it's been around forever. And a lot of people have known. And it wasn't me. So this idea of like, it's in dialogue now, more so than it was just a few years ago. And I think there's, the complexities of the work that people that have been in it for a while that we're seeing, we understand. And that's part of, I think, that this future trend is like, how do we help mitigate the risk for people who are seeing these very positive only representations of what can happen, and then doing it without real attention to setting and dose and testing of substances, trust of the facilitator. Like, these boundary violations happen. That's part of like the do no harm thing that I think is important, like with coaching. And that question is like, there are therapists that still cross these boundaries, even with all their training. But we need to talk about this. We need to do the best we can to help prevent these sorts of violations. But we need to do the best we can to help people from getting into sticky situations, thinking that they're going to take a miracle cure. I think that transference of this fantasy of a magic bullet is a dangerous one with anything.
Yeah. Any words of warning, or anything you wish you would have known when you were about to enter this psychedelic field or psychedelic work, that somebody who's considering working around these substances or in this field would perhaps benefit from?
Just tongue in cheek, the first thing that came to mind was like, writing a book is a lot of work. But I think really just being very mindful and going in eyes wide open about all the different ways that psychedelic experiences can be interpreted, and like the different levels of discourse and dialogue and all of that. There's a paper called Mad Thoughts on Mushrooms by Letcher, is an anthropologist. It's an academic paper with the best non-academic title. But it really breaks down some of the arguments that we hear, and how these substances are viewed, and the interpretation of these experiences, and the different levels of power that are involved in the discourse, the power dynamics involved in each of these levels of discourse. This is from Foucault. So it's an academic paper, but it's a really helpful and important one. I think that is something that's important in orienting ourselves to the diversity of voices in this space.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Last question, no?
Our last one?
Nearly.
So
take a moment.
Nearly.
Feel free to take a moment to think about that.
So if you would take over a screen from any person or group of people, and you have their undivided attention, what would you tell them?
You got a minute, right?
Just a minute.
Of anybody's attention, everybody's attention, or specific people's attention?
You know, my personal answer to this would be a version of the kind of zooming out exercise of where we are on Earth, slowly expanding to get that big picture perspective, and realize that in a very fundamental way, we're all in the same boat in a sliver in time. And I think we need to have that perspective as we go through life. And it's not the whole picture, but it is one that I think is important for us to think about more.
I love that. Do you know Tim Urban? He runs the blog Wait, But Why?
Mm-mm.
It's he has one fantastic article where he really dives into the macro and the micro, like really zooming out and really zooming in. And he does these stickman drawings that like look from a fourth grader. And it's just, he's such a good writer, but it's entertaining, and it's super smart, but it's super, super engaging. And it's such a brilliant way to just show how little things can be and how huge they can be, and where we are in relation to that. So, that
sounds great.
I think you'd like it. I'll dig that out for you.
Yeah, thank you. I might start assigning it to my clients who are interested.
Some of those stickman drawings can probably go on a billboard. That's what sparked it.
Good. Yeah.
Where can people get into your sphere if somebody wanted to work with you or follow your work? Obviously, there's Beyond the Narrow Life, which I really recommend every therapist and coach. It's got so much in it that's going to be so helpful for your work. But like, where else can people get in touch with you?
I think that's the most accessible way, and then email works. I'm not always the best at being able to respond to emails, but I get one of the joys of being on this side of the book writing process is I get random emails from people that are just expressing how excited they are to have been reading through the book, with the specific ways it's helped them. And that's really encouraging to me. So I try to respond to those emails. For people who are, it's simple. It's my simple an idea, like most things. My first last name at gmail.com, but the spelling is KILE.ORTIGO. And so that's one way. I've been helping out more and more. I alluded to this earlier with the CIS program and certification program in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and research. And that's been a joy. They've expanded. They have a San Francisco cohort, a Boston cohort, and online only, and people come from around the world to be a part of that. So I've been pretty regularly involved with that, and will continue to be. And I think it's a nice way to get exposed to a variety of teachers and kind of perspectives. And then you get to meet all these other people who are interested in this. And that's the real joy of any sort of program, I think, is these positive group experiences, connecting with people that you would never have met if you hadn't done something like that. Mm-hmm. So that's a way to, I'm going to probably start mentoring. It's a group mentorship model. So all this group stuff's important. I'll probably start doing that next year for that program. But that's a way for me, because our licenses are tied to our states. So I can't work clinically with anyone outside of California, but I can do mentorship and, all of that and outside, no holds barred for that, which is fun.
Cool. Well, hey, Kyle, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your book. Thank you for being your being. I really like your being, I guess. Thank you for making time for us.
Thank you. Likewise. No, this was a fun conversation. We went to many different places, right? So that was enjoyable.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for all your answers and insights. So it was really, really nice listening to you. Very interesting. Thank you.
Cool. And, if you've listened to this or watched it, let us know what you think. We're talking about coaching and psychedelics. That's not just us. We hope that you do. So if you're listening to this, anybody who's into this, I hope it sparked some conversation. And if these conversations bear any fruits, do let us know, because Kyle, as I very much like to hear what people get from these things. And it's just delightful to see that it resonates and it sparks something and people make it swing. So do it. Talk to each other more. Thank you very much.